It's not fan hype to think that big things are coming down the track in 2025. The Switch 2 is a major event, and new consoles usually come alongside some big games. But what can we expect at the pace of Nintendo's releases in the years ahead? In this video, I want to explore Nintendo's strategies for how it paces out its games and perhaps temper expectations for how quickly Nintendo will pinball into its top franchises on the new system. So please like, subscribe, and ping open another tab for the Patreon before settling in to this Nintendo Forecast deep dive on Nintendo's scheduling pressures. This has definitely felt like the quietest Nintendo month in a very, very long time. Mid 2020, Nintendo basically went radio silent, dropping game news very late on and really offering the bare minimum, but everybody understands those straitened global circumstances. Now we've had a month with just 2 game releases, and both titles that have featured on Nintendo consoles previously. For Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, it is the third outing in the last decade and a half for the Irascible Ape, and the drop was so unhype, Nintendo felt comfortable dropping a Switch 2 trailer on top of it. Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition is a bigger deal, seemingly with more in the way of expanded content, and of course, efforts have been made to spruce it up from the Wii U original, but it still is, in effect, a late-in-the-day port. And as far as the game release schedule going forward, at least in terms of games with confirmed release dates, the rest is silence. The last time we were in such a position without any new game being dated, I think, was again 2020, with Paper Mario The Origami King dropping mid-July and Pikmin 3 Deluxe not getting announced until August. And even early in 2020, Paper Mario The Origami King was first trailed on the 14th of May, while Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition and Clubhouse games were safely slated for May and June. So even mid-pandemic, we tended to get a little bit more information. Tight reveal to release schedules do suit Nintendo very nicely though. For one thing, it does tie in with their focus on surprising and delighting their audience. It means that announcements never go stale. It also allows them to be quite fleet of foot with their announcements and to move their schedule around with a good deal more flexibility than if they committed to dates much further in advance. And it avoids the dread of delays, something which was perceived to plague the Wii U, but in many respects was just a function of so many games being revealed so early. We certainly saw some of the same air quotes curse appearing to dog the 2 Switch titles which were revealed unusually early for Nintendo. Bayonetta 3 was announced in December of 2017, perhaps as a way to spike interest in the newly announced re-release of Bayonetta 1 Plus 2 in February 2018, and yet the first Bayonetta 3 trailer didn't drop until September 2021, and it wasn't ultimately released until October of 2022, nearly 5 whole years after the game was announced. And of course, the saga of Metroid Prime 4 is still going, with the game first announced in June 2017, the company confirming that the project had been restarted with new developers in January 2019, and then radio silence for a further 5.5 years until the June 2024 Direct finally gave us a subtitle, Beyond, and just a few precious minutes of footage. Less dramatically, we saw Animal Crossing New Horizons delayed out of 2019 and into March of 2020, while Splatoon 3 and Xenoblade Chronicles 3 did the curious trick of swapping release dates in 2022, which pushed back Splatoon but brought the world some Xenoblade goodness a little bit earlier than would otherwise have been the case. The thing is, delays are a natural byproduct of any games project, but particularly ones where the developers focus on quality over everything else and don't want to force their much valued team members into breakfast cereal levels of crunch. Although once upon a time, crunch was so embedded into Japanese culture that 3 a.m. finishes on Super Mario 64 were considered perfectly normal, there is a lot of evidence that Nintendo has mitigated this since, with reports that as far back as the development of Metroid Prime 2, the studio tried to find ways to avoid the intense work environments that characterized the first Metroid Prime title's development. And also, crunch only makes sense, and I'm talking here logistically rather than ethically, which is a whole different matter, but it only makes sense for a particular kind of working structure. If you are focused only on the single game and are hiring a lot of people for relatively short contracts, there is an economic rationale to essentially sweat the assets and try to accelerate towards the finish line. But Nintendo has a large number of internal teams, and even where it does bring in outsiders as support, these are often people with extremely long relationships with Nintendo. No single game, however crucial to the company, is going to be worth the collateral damage of driving even a small number of precious, talented developers out of the industry. Now, that's not to say that working for Nintendo isn't, I'm sure, quite intense at times. It is a Japanese company with a Japanese work culture, and as much as Nintendo has tried to expand over the years, it is still the case that their hardware-software development team is the engine for the company's success or failure. But while I'm sure they're not afraid of an intense work environment, it does seem that their focus is on quality, and so the time is given to get things right. Pikmin 4 took over a decade. The 3D Zelda series since Ocarina of Time have taken progressively longer and longer with every iteration. On the other hand, games that are more reliable in their scheduling tend to feel less content rich. The Pokemon Company has stuck to a 3 yearly schedule for generational Pokemon games for 4 consecutive generations, and only now are we seeing what appears to be a longer gap with no apparent game in 2025, and that's after a title was criticised for being buggy, forcing Nintendo into the considerable embarrassment of issuing an apology for performance issues. And these were not the only games which seem to have arrived fairly undercooked. Mario Strikers Battle League was released 2.5 years after Next Level Games finished up Luigi's Mansion 3, and while I enjoyed it for what it was, it definitely felt underweight even compared to previous Mario sports titles like Golf and Tennis, which might not have had Sakurai game levels of content, but did at least boast adventure modes and a good deal of post-game support, such as locations with distinctly different gameplay, unlike Strikers' identikit pitches. Splatoon 3 is seen by many as a little too safe and iterative compared to its predecessors, but to be fair, the team had also put out Animal Crossing New Horizons in the 5 year interval since Splatoon 2 launched. Another game, by the way, where fans of New Leaf felt that the new title sometimes didn't feel as fully featured as the game they had been playing for much of the previous decade. And while that's frustrating for players, it's also perfectly comprehensible as a business strategy that Nintendo can't make every single title a quadruple A experience, because Nintendo's scope for development is limited, and particularly this was the case coming off of the Wii U era. Nintendo has amassed ever larger number of developers in recent times and has forged great partnerships with other companies as well who can support. But then again, expectations of games have increased as well, not least in terms of graphics. Upscaling technology may help bring more detailed graphics into reach without stretching the development teams quite so much, but relying on AI as a default isn't really Nintendo's MO, and so the development period for games can be expected to stretch out over time. It makes sense, therefore, that Zelda Breath of the Wild, which was in many respects a cornerstone game for them and probably their most significant title since Wii Sports or even Super Mario 64, was given a huge amount of content and clearly benefited from a large number of developers, with much of the 2D Zelda team and a good portion of Monolith Soft and others being folded into the development staff for at least part of the time. Then there's Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, which leveraged 2 decades of Smash Bros. Games to make a title that was, as the name suggests, the ultimate one. Instead of seeing further by standing on the shoulders of giants, Sakurai developed more by standing on his own shoulders, Russian doll style. And of course, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe started out as a version of Mario Kart 8 with the DLC and a few minor modes tacked on, but has now, through the joys of the Booster Course Pass, become a truly gigantic Mario Kart epic. But this raises another difficulty, which is that Nintendo is now in a very different position from 2017. In some respects, of course, they're in a far stronger position. They're more financially secure, their staff numbers are far huger, the Switch is a successful concept, and there is every chance that the sequel system will make at least a strong account of itself in the marketplace. But while in the early days of Switch they could rest on the Wii U's back catalogue for oven-ready ports, now the cupboard is barer. It's not just that they have mostly, though not completely, exhausted the Wii U library of games of a similar power level to the Switch, but also a good number of their classic games are now available on NSO. And while it's not impossible for them to remake a game that has appeared on the online service, in the medium term it's near inevitable, and there is precedent with games like Samus Returns and the new Link's Awakening being released while the Game Boy versions of their predecessors were still available for the 3DS Virtual Console. There is a lot they can remake or even remaster, and it would be foolish to bet against Nintendo leveraging its deep game archive for continued success, but they will have to dig a little deeper, and these remakes will generally require more attention and focus to make sure that they stand out on a new console. And more to the point, Nintendo's core games are now familiar to a much larger range of people. If New Leaf mechanics were being served up as new for months in New Horizons, most New Horizons fans didn't really care because the New Horizons install base was about 3 times that of New Leaf. Many people simply hadn't played the previous game. Now, Nintendo didn't appear to have anticipated this. In fact, a recent Kit and Krista guest confirmed that Animal Crossing New Horizons massively outshot their sales forecast, something I think we all knew, and so they obviously anticipated that the franchise would hold steady with the same mechanics plus just a few original concepts, plus just being on the Switch as opposed to the 3DS. But it's difficult to think that the 50 million people who will have played Animal Crossing New Horizons, let alone all the family members during the pandemic who looky-looed at their family's islands, would be surprised and delighted by a new title that didn't feel substantially different and evolved compared to what has gone before. Many people were surprised and even a little disappointed that Animal Crossing New Horizons, such a successful title, was essentially cut short from new content in 2021. I have examined the credits in a separate video, and while there remains some overlap with the Splatoon 3 team, the fact is that the majority of people are actually now completely separate on the Splatoon and Animal Crossing groups, and I expect those two teams to continue to develop as separate groups. After all, both franchises are now absolutely massive for Nintendo, their biggest alongside Mario and Zelda, and that means it makes sense only for them to receive huge individual focus. And yet, that creates issues of its own. For Splatoon, the game relies on regular iteration to monetize it. Otherwise, the ongoing costs to maintain the game start to eat away at the profit accrued from the original sale. DLC for Splatoon has so far concentrated on the one-player experience, which, while exciting, feels like a small part of the overall experience that people are paying for. Even with Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, they did find a way to monetize the game mid-generation without issuing a new title, but for Splatoon, the way to do this seems to be to sell a new version of the game. I think the expectation has to be that Switch 2 will see both a fourth and a fifth version of Splatoon as a result. Now, there is potential, as I've discussed in a previous video, for a Splatoon spin-off to mark time and give them a bit of leeway until they are ready for Splatoon 4. And I think there is every chance that Nintendo could develop a more fully featured evolution of the concept by 2026 or even 2025, given that this time the development team won't have been shared with Animal Crossing. I know some people state that the team rely on the final Splatfest to determine the direction of the game, but this strikes me as more of an aesthetic decision. Building the world of Splatoon 4 can be done relatively quickly. It seems that the world of Breath of the Wild, massive as it is, only took about a year or so to put together. The real innovation comes with those core mechanics, and if the core team were working on these through to the DLC's completion in early 2024, 2 years of all hands on deck focus from the team, and perhaps a bit of outside support from Bandai Namco or Monolith Soft, could conceivably see a title ready by 2026. Similarly, with Animal Crossing, although it took 8 years for the new leaf to bloom into a beautiful new horizon, the team was extremely busy during this time, with the broader team producing not one but two Splatoon titles, plus the core dev staff who stuck with Animal Crossing working with Nintendo Cube on Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival and developing the Happy Home Designer spin-off. Clearly, a lot of thought was given to Animal Crossing New Horizons' unique features, the crafting mechanic and such like, but I just don't think this was given or even was considered to require the kind of all-out focus that, for example, Breath of the Wild once received. I don't personally expect Animal Crossing now to return for at least another 2 years, not until the Switch 2 is ready for a light model, if only because the one island per console restriction, punitive even on Switch, would seem especially forbidding as a proposition for Animal Crossing's many more casual potential audience members for a much more high-priced console. 7 or 8 years should be time enough, though, to develop something that feels substantially new. Note, I don't say substantially larger. Animal Crossing New Horizons is already a game with an awful lot in it, and look at the precedent of Super Mario Bros. Wonder, itself a game that had effectively gestated for 11 years while the team focused on Mario Maker and Pikmin. This is not a huge game in many respects, but it is a game that is packed with, well, wonder. In an era where games like Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey, love them though I do, will often reiterate boss fights and side quest gimmicks for extra content, for new moons or Korok seeds, Super Mario Bros. Wonder hardly ever reuses its weird Wonder Flower concepts and is all the more delightful for its parsimony. What's going to take the time for Splatoon, for Animal Crossing, and for other games is getting these new concepts right. Of course, that's not to say that every game is going to be a seismic break with what went before. Tears of the Kingdom is, I think, a little underappreciated in just how much it innovates on the original, but that's largely because it uses the exact same world, with the depths and the sky being largely quite empty. But while 6 years and change felt like an absolute age to wait, given that much of this was during the pandemic and compared to the length of time Mario Kart and the new 3D Mario will have been cooking, one could argue that this was basically a game that was rushed out of the door. Imagine if Nintendo had decided to hold Tears of the Kingdom over as a launch game for the new system. With another 2 years in the oven, the time it took to flesh out the whole world of Breath of the Wild originally, they could surely have made the depths and the sky incredibly dense with content. Perhaps they should have, though I think that wait would have been painful enough, and ultimately I'm very happy with what we got and very excited for the next Zelda to chart new territory. Still, this brings us back to the long wait we are experiencing at the moment, and I do think an underappreciated part of Nintendo's considerations is finding ways to hide production gaps as much as possible. I've talked before about how Nintendo has managed the incredible feat in the Switch era of never going more than about 11 weeks between new releases, and usually having a new release at intervals between 3 and 8 weeks for most of the system's titles on the shelves. But between ports and those undernourished Mario Strikers style titles, this has clearly required some tactical deployment of resources. A lot of digital ink has been spilled on Nintendo wanting to have a robust games lineup for the Switch 2's launch, and I'm sure that is true, but I think what's underestimated is just that the longer they leave the Switch 2 at all, the more time they can give themselves to make the next generation of experiences, all of them from Nintendo, as great as they can be. As expansive as Nintendo's teams have become, and with a new building on the way to accommodate all the developers, it will probably become even huger, they still have set the bar quite high. I think for a precedent to what we should expect in this era, we should look back to the time of the Super NES. The original NES had given us incredible, original, groundbreaking experiences. Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, and so the Super NES had the responsibility of topping these, and of course, it did so with aplomb. Super Mario World, Zelda, A Link to the Past, and Super Metroid were dazzling steps forward of the sort that frankly most generational leaps did not match. Super Mario Sunshine to Super Mario Galaxy, or Galaxy 2 to Super Mario 3D World, or Wind Waker to Twilight Princess. These are all very different experiences, but I don't think any of them necessarily feel like a perfection of what went before. But now, once again, Nintendo has a suite of proof of concept games. Maybe they're not all new, and in some cases they're based on ideas that are decades old, but because of the Switch's gigantic audience, they have been embraced by a large number of people as new, and so Nintendo now needs to offer the Super NES version of these concepts to tempt people back for a second time. And we have already seen this in action to a small degree in the Mario Party franchise. Super Mario Party in 2018 was huge in terms of sales success, far larger than anyone was expecting, I think, despite the history of Mario Party games doing decently well. Mario Party Superstars filled a niche, but was essentially a remake of previous content. But Super Mario Party Jamboree won plaudits for taking the concept people loved, but simply delivering on a huge scale. Whether Nintendo Cube has the capacity to do the same in 3 years' time, or whether they decide to pivot into another remake-centric game remains to be seen, but I think Jamboree is the template for where Nintendo need to go with their Heartland franchises at this point. I have little doubt that the new 3D Mario will feel as massive a leap from Odyssey as Odyssey was over 3D World. I think the same expectation for a stratospheric leap can hold true for Animal Crossing, for Zelda, for Switch Sports, even for 2D Metroid, which will likely have had a very long development time by the time the next game in that series comes out, probably in 2026. I'm not saying that Nintendo will be done with more cheap and cheerful titles, but just as Mario Tennis Ultra Smash was almost comically bare bones, but then again was soon forgotten as Mario Tennis Aces rushed to the court, I just can't see the next Mario Strikers lacking for content the same way when they have the original Strikers to build on. Splatoon and Pokemon are trickier just because of the requirements for regular releases, and so I would anticipate these series taking smaller steps forward, but hopefully still sufficiently decisive ones to mollify their audience base, something I think will worry Nintendo far more in the case of Splatoon, which is still a younger franchise and less buttressed by a wider media empire than Pokemon, where their ownership status is a little more complicated anyway. This does mean that we will need to do a bit of expectations setting for the Switch 2's games. Yes, Nintendo's first few years usually do include a large number of megaton first-party games. 2017 saw 3D Zelda, Mario Kart, Splatoon, and 3D Mario. 2018 saw Mario Party and Smash. 2019 saw Mario Maker, Luigi's Mansion, Ring Fit Adventure, and Pokemon. 2020 had Animal Crossing. It is reasonable to think that by the end of 2028, all these franchises are likely to come back for another bite of the cherry. But we should also consider that Nintendo will still need to cut its cloth accordingly, and this will mean that some games may feel rather undercooked for others to get a major push. I also think we need to appreciate that some games that seem to have had a long time in the oven may still feel relatively modest in scope because the time hasn't necessarily gone into just generating more and more content, but into developing crucial new mechanics, a lesson very evident in Tears of the Kingdom. I am reminded of Nintendo's longtime president until 2002, Hiroshi Yamauchi, who once noted, "Cutting-edge technologies and multiple functions do not necessarily lead to more fun. The excessively hardware-oriented way of thinking is totally wrong, but manufacturers are just throwing money at developing higher performance hardware." Now look, Nintendo at this stage in its life can't fully avoid the game size arms race, and as I noted with the precedent of the Super NES sequels and Super Mario Party Jamboree, this is clearly part of their strategy, but it also means they need time and space to explore new concepts that are going to drive games, even if this means scrapping projects, as seems to have happened along the way of the development of Metroid Prime 4 and possibly also Pikmin 4. I think Nintendo also can afford to be a little bit slower in revealing their very biggest titles this time out. Partly this is because with the graphical arms race appearing to slow, with even Sony seeming to slightly release their foot on the gas of their once rigorous 6 yearly console release schedules, there may be a little bit more leeway before they need to release all of these games. But also, it suits their long-term strategy to be very slightly slower. The focus must still be on getting the biggest evergreens out early for the simple reason that they are evergreens, and the longer they are on shelves, the longer they can be expected to sell. However, the Switch's more than 8-year lifespan has to be something that they aspire to recreate a second time, if only because they need that level of time now to build the kind of experiences their audience expects going forward. Equally, in the unlikely event that the Switch 2 flops, I don't think this means that they will rush the big experiences to market any faster. They had Zelda Breath of the Wild up their sleeve as a mid-generation Wii U game. I know it ended up as the end-of-generation game, but surely it was never intended to be this from its first inception. But having such a major game up Nintendo's sleeves allowed them to pivot to the Nintendo Switch with a major launch title. Remember, the Switch, like the DS and less successfully, the Virtual Boy, was originally pitched as a third branch of Nintendo consoles alongside the handhelds and home consoles of the time. If and when the Switch concept starts to tire, I would expect Nintendo to pivot mid-generation, and so having Zelda, Splatoon 5, and potentially a new take on Smash if the Switch 2 keeps with a deluxe edition of Ultimate at the beginning, well, having that plan B, though we'll hope they don't have to use it, has to be part of their contingency planning at least. But what I hope we'll see alongside is a much denser lineup of titles that aren't going to be 20 million sellers, but are still of strong quality. Titles that Nintendo has spent a lot of capital and time in the Switch years cultivating as more major players. The early Switch only had a few such regular franchises to fall back on: a Warriors game, a Xenoblade title, a Kirby game, Mario Tennis, and, well, not much else until a lot later in the console's life. But now we have teams dedicated to 2D Zelda, 2D Metroid, Famicom Detective Club, a team heavily involved in Pikmin in the form of 18, plus they are partners with recent experience of making series like Another Code, Advance Wars, Mario Strikers, Pokemon Snap, Mario and Luigi, and, as per my recent EPD4 deep dive, an internal team mostly focused on Switch sports. If these can become recurring 4-yearly franchises alongside Xenoblade, Fire Emblem, Mario Tennis and Golf, Xenoblade, and the Warriors tie-ins, and if they can add to this list other franchises, perhaps Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, ARMS, Ring Fit Adventure, Nintendog, Star Fox, F-Zero, Famicom, Makashi Banashi, and Mario Baseball, the chances are that Nintendo can retain their dense lineup of games going forward without needing to fall back overly on ports and bare bones entries, and without overly accelerating their most important evergreen titles. This will free up their core teams for the most ambitious projects. Now, for specifics on exactly which games might be revealed and when, I'm going to cycle back to this in a future video. For now, though, thanks to everybody who likes, shares, comments, subscribes, and checks out the Patreon, and I shall look forward to seeing you again next time for another Nintendo Forecast.